Somehow there are only 3 regular season games left for Ohio State. That's also the perfect number of thoughts for a Thursday. Welcome to the Podcast Daily. That's Jeremy Birmingham. I am Austin Ward. Birm, you've been missing in action from the last few shows. You got to give us a health update before Saturday.
I'm still alive. That's as good as I can say. I'm just trying to stay off the things that move me along, staying off the feet.
Staying off that move you along.
Yeah, my people movers. I'm just trying to stay off of them to make sure. Here's the thing. I really did think like heading into Saturday against Purdue, like I felt pretty okay. And then just maybe went a little too hard on Saturday and just need time to keep the elevation. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. It's the Rice method, folks. If you have bursitis or arthritis or any other sort of itis that has to deal with your joints, it's the Rice method.
Okay. Well,
Rice.
Good. Let's make sure that
I'm not going to die. I just have a tough time moving at the moment, which is not ideal for someone who needs to move as a requisite of their job.
I'm not going to die. Famous last words and a bold P on Thursday from Burn. All right, let's get to it.
If I die, if he dies, he dies. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'd prefer that you don't. At least, I don't know. Make it through this season at least, and then we can regroup from there.
That really is the thing. Like, I know what I really need, which is like a month of relative not moving. And we could potentially have 8 games left in this season, which is nuts considering it's November 13th.
Yeah.
But there's potentially 8 games left. So it's just, it's about, call me the LeBron James of the Ohio State beat right now. It's just, I'm old and it's work management. It's load management.
But you're also one of the greatest of all time. So you truly are the LeBron James. Can't really argue with it. All right, let's get into the 3 thoughts on this Thursday. Number 1, the first thing, you missed the stock report, but you wanted to weigh in. As Bill and I wrapped up earlier this week, you had one that came to mind. So thing number 1 for you is the hottest stock that you're watching.
Yeah, I prior to the game against Purdue, I was watching the Ohio State team walk out of the tunnel and watching the defensive linemen. And I thought to myself, when I saw Joshua Mickens, I was like, man, we don't talk about him. And there's good reason for it. I mean, the edge position at Ohio State is not one that is getting a lot of attention. This week, maybe it gets more of it because of the jack implementation that we saw against Purdue. And maybe that lends the door for Mitchell Melton or CJ Hicks to be out there. We saw Hicks, it wasn't in the jack, but he had that clear, open look at the quarterback when he was lined up on the edge and had a free runner on Saturday. I've heard rumblings throughout the last few months that Josh Mickens is a guy that Ohio State just continues to be like, man, he makes plays. He's impactful. And then he got out there, and I think it was his first play that he was in. He got a sack, and then the next play he was in the backfield again. And as the defense evolves, and I think this is really the conversation, it's certainly not a stock for this year, but as the defense evolves and this current defensive line group moves on to the NFL, I do think that there is a case to be made that Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson, provided Larry's still there, he does have a 2-year contract, so like we expect him to be. I do think that there's a real possibility that we see Ohio State move to much more of a 3-4 look next year. And if that's the case, I think a guy like Josh Mickens, who was kind of an afterthought in his recruiting class, has not been discussed a lot since, is a player that I think makes a lot of sense to make some noise for Ohio State because he's got a really, really good first step, violent hands, and just plays with an edge and with an intensity out there. And the more I think about what Caden Curry brings and Caden McDonald, man, I think there are some juice bringers on this defense waiting to get an opportunity to play. And that's not a knock on the old heads that are there, but people always want to see the new shiny toy. And I think Josh Mickens is a toy maybe we're forgetting about.
I do think that that's an interesting part of this conversation. Like even as recently as, 6 weeks ago, Ryan Day would get questions about this. Jim Knowles would get questions about not just the jack specifically, but 3-man fronts or more varied fronts. And the conversation would be, well, Ohio State has recruited to a 4-3 front as well as it possibly could. And with Jack and JT out there, you could say, yeah, that seems pretty true. Those are both 5-star guys. But they have also been recruiting athletes like Josh Mickens, like Arvell Reese, like CJ Hicks, Mitchell Melton for 2 years when healthy was talked about playing in that jack role. Like, they were also doing that. And over this summer and throughout this cycle that you could probably shed much greater light on, that has still been a position that Ohio State has been trying to emphasize. I think the part that was frustrating to hear or watch or analyze was like, yeah, you have a 4 down front. They'd be really good. It doesn't have to be the only thing you do, because you have these other guys over here, including Caden Curry or including Arvell Reese or CJ Hicks or Josh Mickens, who you recruited to do some of these things, and you're just not. That was pretty frustrating.
Yeah, and it's really, and I don't want to gas up any comments that Nick Saban made or anyone else have made, but Ohio State, even still, you brought up the summer and the recruiting stuff, and that's obviously, we could talk about Justin Hill, the linebacker / edge prospect down at Cincinnati Winton Woods High School, who's committed to Alabama, who did not pick Ohio State because he had not seen that position be deployed by the Buckeyes. And there was conversation in the recruitment of Hill, which was, hey, we're still probably not going to do that this year, but we're going to next year. So you just got to trust us. And that's not something that works. But it's not even just that. When you're talking about a 4-3, a 4-man front, even though Ohio State doesn't play a traditional 4-3, it's harder and harder to recruit linebackers into a 4-3 because those guys feel like they're kind of hemmed into a defense that is very rigid and not allowing for athletes to do athletic things. And Ohio State, a guy like TJ Alford down in Florida, who's been committed to the Buckeyes since March, he's a player that, right now Miami and Florida State are saying, hey, why would you go to Ohio State as an outside linebacker when they don't let outside linebackers do outside linebacker things? And those are conversations that Ohio State is going to have internally about how you diffuse that worry mongering that's happening, or the idea that Ohio State is not letting its athletes do athletic things. When you see guys like Josh Mickens getting a chance to get in the game and make plays, and it's like, oh, they actually do have dudes who can do something different.
Yeah. And I think since Saturday and since that, 4-play stretch with the jack, later on Thursday on the podcast, Buckeye Q will be out, and Zach Boren took a look at those 4 plays. I think the more that I watched them, the more encouraged I was by what that package could be. Now, especially once you maybe get JT and Jack involved, or Tyleek Williams on the nose, which was not happening. But even with the substitution package out there, they weren't that far off. And maybe in the moment, I thought that it was because of focusing on the outcome and that Purdue was able to move the ball on all 4 plays. Maybe that's the experiment and that's over. Ryan Day did talk about that on Tuesday, Berm, where it's like they saw some things you liked. And when you rewatched it back, there was one of those 4 plays, both Caleb Downs and Cody Simon missed a tackle. I bet that doesn't happen again for the rest of the season. The very first play that they were out there, the defensive line got pressure with Kenyatta Jackson, with Caden McDonald. The hand gets up. Kenyatta Jackson forces a really bad throw, and it's kind of a fluky reception. The coverage drifts a little bit from CJ Hicks, but everything was just a little bit off, which, you can chalk that up to the first time you're doing it or who was on the field or whatever. But I did see some real potential there.
I think if you rerun those 3 plays, and I know you and Zach went over it, the pressure on the quarterback for 3 consecutive plays was as good as we've seen from Ohio State at any point this year. If you run that first play again over and over, if you run that 10 times, I bet CJ Hicks returns that to the end zone 6 times out of 10. It was, you can get to the quarterback by in other ways other than just sending your defensive end straight up the field. And I think the more Ohio State is able to show that, the better it's going to be. Maybe it doesn't become a staple for this year, but again, there's potentially 8 games left. There's a lot of time for things to rotate and to be innovated over these next potentially 2 months. So it was encouraging. And, when you see guys like Joshua Mickens, or you see what happens with Mitchell Melton on the field, and not even just Mitchell Melton in the jack as he was against Purdue, but you saw him against Penn State as a traditional 4-3 end, getting in there, making plays, stopping the run in the middle of at the line of scrimmage. There's an opportunity to just keep getting guys in the game. And I really like that Ryan Day seems to be driving the bus to say, what I kind of said all offseason. Like, you don't have to wait until the fourth quarter to get these guys in the game. Just give them a rep or two, get them out. Now I can nitpick and say that I don't think that they should be on there for a whole series or a whole possession until the next guy, until the stop happens. That might be folly, but I do think that there's an opportunity and a real likelihood we see Ohio State rotate a lot more between now and whenever the season ends.
Yeah, I certainly think that they will on Saturday against Northwestern. It's a need to get through that game. We've talked about that all week already, probably still will on Friday and Saturday. So, but that's thing number one, a little bit of a bonus stock for me to squeeze in there. Thing number two, Berm, just one thing you've been thinking about all week since Saturday. I love when I do this because I have no idea what it is you've been thinking about, especially this week.
I've had, and I'm glad that I think it was Adam King of the Notebook fame who brought it up at the Woody Hayes on Tuesday about the Heisman Trophy and why Will Howard is not getting more discussion about it. And I think it's something that has been on my mind because on Monday night I was at home watching basketball with my brothers, and they were like, "Hey, how come Will Howard doesn't look at his numbers next to Dylan Gabriel's?" And I'm like, "Well, Dylan Gabriel has one additional number next to his name, and that's 1-0 versus Ohio State." And I do think that if Will Howard and the Buckeyes had won that game, that we would hear a lot more of that conversation. But people are dismissing what he's done for some reason because Ohio State has talented players around it, as though Dylan Gabriel doesn't. I don't really understand that, but it's certainly. I think there's a real chance still, depending on how things go this weekend against Indiana, against Michigan, for Will Howard to end up in New York as a Heisman finalist, because I think that there's an opportunity for him to come out and put up some big numbers over the next few weeks, even if he's only in the game for a little bit or half against Northwestern, which has to be the hope. But he deserves to be in that conversation. I know people think that we gas up Will Howard too much, but like, just look around the country and look at the quarterback play. As I said on Monday at the live show, like, it's pretty bad. And so when you see Will Howard, who is not just leading the Buckeyes, he has clearly separated himself as the absolute only quarterback that Ohio State feels is capable of running this offense. They're the number 2 team in the country. Like, in a normal world, the Buckeyes would be getting a lot of attention for their quarterback play, and they're not.
I think if Ohio State wins the next 4 games, that Will Howard will absolutely be a Heisman Trophy finalist. I don't know how he could be denied in that circumstance. Like, his numbers stack up against all the rest. That was even going on a couple of weeks ago when Drew Aller had better gambling odds, which, like, we don't control that part. Drew Aller was a quote unquote better, more appealing Heisman Trophy candidate than Will Howard going into that game. And like, Will Howard didn't put up amazing numbers in that game, and he started with a pick 6. So like, I can understand why maybe that doesn't impress or blow away the voters. But at that moment, once you zoom out and take the big picture, and you're going to look at the collective stats that he puts up, and if Ohio State is a 12-1 Big Ten champion with a revenge game against Oregon, which for him, he nearly led them to that victory the first time around, I think he'll be there. I don't know that he'll be able to win it, because this race, more than others, I feel like, is very different, where there is not a clear-cut favorite to win that award. I think people believe that Travis Hunter is maybe the best overall player in college football. I probably wouldn't argue against that point, but I think that the next 4 weeks are going to determine who wins the Heisman in a way that hasn't always been the case with this award.
Yeah, I think this is the season where a lot of people, you look at the landscape of college football and you say, well, there's no great team. There's no one that's, you look at, say, that's the surefire, clear-cut national championship winner, et cetera. I think that those sort of years lend to people who are voting for the Heisman to going outside of the box a little bit. And I think that's where a guy like Travis Hunter, who I think I have him at plus 5,000 on Fanatics before the season. So I'm still kind of hoping for that. Or obviously Ashton Genty at Boise State is another guy. Like, I don't think like those two, are going to be at the Heisman finals. I think there's an expectation that Cam Ward will be, but I don't think that should be the case, depending on how the things work out for Miami over the next few weeks. But whichever quarterback wins the Big Ten out of Dylan Gabriel and Will Howard, I think will be there. And I don't mean to dismiss Curtis Rourke at Indiana. He's obviously still in that conversation as well. If they go out and beat Ohio State and Indiana and Oregon, I think Curtis Rourke should be in that conversation, but I do think it will end up being like an honorary award for winning the Big Ten, which has 4 of the top 5 teams in the current playoff rankings.
Yeah, turns out that wouldn't be very easy. Although for Indiana, I mean, I don't know. I guess they'll have to do that twice. If they wind up, you're right. If they wind up winning the Big Ten, they will have 2 significant victories by that point, even if they don't have any yet. I am still just blown away by Lathan Ransom's return from injury. And it struck home for me because I've been thinking about it, and I watched some of the plays that he made. Since day one, he's been playing with maybe more consistent energy and emotion than at any point in his career, and one of the most consistent outputs of intensity of anybody on Ohio State's defense, which is full of guys that are playing very hard and very well. He often gets appreciated most when he's not out there, which I think is a little bit unfair because it's not appreciating how great he's been playing. But I thought he would still be recovering from that injury against Oregon at this point. And like, this might be the time that he comes back, or next week against Indiana. And the fact that he's been able to play not just against Penn State at a high level, and even not just that he played in both of those games, that he's playing at a high level against both Penn State and Purdue. His grade out, according to PFF on Saturday against Purdue, was his highest of the season overall. It was over 90. That's very difficult to accomplish. We can take whatever we want. Again, caveat as always, grains of salt for what those grades are worth. But I'm amazed. And he's joked about it a couple of times coming off the practice field or after games. Like, shout out to Stewie, training staff. They're the GOATs. Like, they must really be, because this is remarkable what Lathan Ransom is doing.
I wonder if I could get Stu to take a look at me and give me.
You should.
No, honestly, we both heard the speculation when the rumored injury at the end of the Oregon games started. When we were like, okay, that doesn't sound good, and there were people saying it could be 3-4 weeks, people saying it could be longer. The fact that it ended up being 2 weeks is really incredible. But like Tyleik Williams, Lathan Ransom is a guy on this Ohio State team that, as you just said, like, you only really talk about him when he's not there because of all the other superstars and all of the other recruiting accolades. And, I knew when Caleb Downs transferred to Ohio State that he was going to be really, really good. I don't know that people nationally have ever given Lathan Ransom the credit he deserves. And I'm afraid that on the national perspective, he's getting almost like picked up by people saying, well, he's just good now because Caleb Downs is there. And like, he's always been this good. Now he's stronger than he's ever been. He's making plays. The emotion, I think, is the difference. Like, we're seeing him be the unquestioned emotional leader of the defense. And that's why when you lose him for a game or two, or why you lost him at the end of last season, that you really can't replace it. And then you throw on the fact that he without injuries, Lathan Ransom's probably a top 3-round pick in the NFL draft. And I don't know where he's going to end up, but it's probably going to be something like Baltimore and just piss me right off, or Pittsburgh, because they always draft smartly and they draft the right guys and guys who are winners. But Lathan Ransom is a winner, and he's going to play for a long time in the NFL. And Ohio State fans should be grateful that, not only did he come back after last year's injury, but that he's refusing to go down without a fight this year.
I'm going to jump to a wild, unnecessary hindsight conclusion that can't be proven and is probably wrong anyway. But Lathan Ransom not playing against Nebraska. That's the whole reason. That was flat because they didn't have number 8 out there.
I will say the 2-point conversion return and the interception return last week against Purdue, Lathan maybe not as fast as I thought he was, but he's in the right spots. He's making all the play. He's making the tackles that he has to make. He's not getting beat over the top. Like, I think back to the stupid Georgia game and him one-on-one on the outside against A.D. Miller or A.D. whoever Georgia's receiver was. What was his name?
I don't know.
Whatever.
I blocked that play out of my mind.
And I'm like, man, that's really unfair. Now he's not being put in those positions now, so you don't have to worry about him, getting burnt on an 85-yard touchdown pass on a 9 route by a 10-3 guy. But he has been awesome, just absolutely awesome.
All right,
and he's been one of our favorite kids since we started covering him and recruiting. So just someone who you really like have to look at and go, he's the same kid he was in 2018 as he is now. And like when that happens 5 years later, all of the things that happen, he could have decided to not go to Ohio State when Jeff Hafley left, et cetera. Like you just have to be really thrilled when situations like that happen. And then you get like bonus years out of them, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. And hard to believe, quite frankly. All right. That's 2 things down. Number 3. So I'm obviously pretty annoyed at the Big Ten and Northwestern for playing this game.
You said you weren't going to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm just introing thing number 3 because I don't know. So I'm not going to make that my thing. I'm just saying it's building to all the annoyance that might be going around because Ohio State is also annoyed with me for the notebook. Ohio State fans are annoyed at the Big Ten and Fox for all the noon games. There's a lot of annoyance going on this week. What are you annoyed by, Berm?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of things. I got a lot of problems with you people. No, I mean, I think it's fair if we talk about that notebook thing. That's ultimately falls on me. My job is something that
not you alone. It falls.
My motto is do no harm, and I'm upset that I didn't catch the sound that was still left on that clip with CJ, who I've known since he was 15, and like it is very frustrating that situation happened. But I don't want to beat a dead horse about it. It shouldn't be a big deal because it's not a big deal. Kids play high energy, high emotion sports, and then they have things that they're venting about after a game, and they know we're recording, and they trust that we will take care of them. And I'm frustrated that despite turning the decibels down in that clip about 35 decibels, it was still audible enough for someone to hear, but I couldn't hear it when I was editing it inside of Ohio Stadium because of just the noise of Ohio Stadium. So I will own it in that more so than, you told me after I edited it the first time, hey, let's get this taken out of here. And we did, but it wasn't good enough, and that's on us.
Yep.
What's really annoying me is that the college football playoff people are already setting up a scenario where they take a 3-loss SEC team over a 1-loss Indiana. And that's, I get that people will look at Indiana's schedule, and provided Ohio State beats them, they'll say, well, the only good team they played, they lost to. Like, I don't care, man. That's garbage. You can't be sitting here talking about excuses already for Alabama or LSU or Georgia if they lose again. Like it's already beginning to happen and percolate, and you can see the ESPN machinations all over it, and it's making me very, very annoyed. And I can talk about the big noon kickoff games and how much that annoys me too, because it is really screwing with Ohio State's ability to bring in big name recruits. Like already Jared Curtis, the #1 ranked quarterback in the class of 2026, who recently decommitted from Georgia, was expected to visit Ohio State for the Indiana game. Here we are now 9 days before that, and I think that visit's not going to happen because of big noon kickoff. So like this is happening every week to the Buckeyes, where it's hurting them and their ability to bring kids in. That's one facet of why sometimes kids aren't making the visits. There's other ones that are different, more of a result of the era of college football we live in. But it is screwed up already that the machine is trying to make an excuse to keep Indiana out of the game. And they're not going to do that to Penn State, even though Penn State lost to Ohio State and hasn't really beaten anybody either. But because Penn State's brand is bigger than Indiana, you can see why they're making that overture.
I wonder if that's really going on, outside of the fact that there are no other Big Ten teams in the top 25 from the selection committee, even though there's 4 in the top 5. When it comes down to the actual selection day, this is what I believe, because they've proven it time and time again. They will almost always wind up erring on the side of the lowest number in the loss column. Like, they don't put that much thought into it. I think we'll spend more time debating and worrying and stressing and thinking about doomsday scenarios than they actually will, because once the time comes for them to make that decision, with one notable exception, which applied to Ohio State, they are almost always going to say, well, you got to win games, and Indiana won all those games, and losing to Ohio State on the road is not enough reason to keep them out. am going to sit here and be skeptical that worst case scenario would happen, because to do that with a 3-loss team versus 1-loss Indiana would be just unconscionable. And
I hope you're right, but the mouthpieces for the CFP are starting to chirp. And normally when that happens, there's a reason why it's happening, because they've been sort of given the green light to throw out a trial balloon.
That's also why I continue to hate the fact that they're putting these out every Tuesday when they don't actually matter. All they are feeding into conspiracy theories. And I'm not saying that you have a tinfoil hat on right now, but like that is every week that you have to try and parse what they're going to do. And every week they change their mind.
Was it Pete Nakos? He talked to Ward Manuel, Pete Nakos from On 3. And I could be completely wrong, taking it out of context. All I saw was the tweet. I didn't read the story, where he said he asked Ward Manuel the difference between Miami and SMU. And the response was that Cam Ward is fun to watch. Like I have
not read the transcript from Tuesday night, so I do not know the answer to that.
That is that's what Pete's tweet said. Like it just shows the subjectivity that goes into these decisions. And if I've heard national people postulate that if Indiana had a different logo, then they wouldn't be having this conversation. But it's hard not to see that being the case. Like when you look at the Ole Misses of the world, or Tennessee, if Tennessee loses to Georgia this weekend and then loses another one, like how realistic is it, do you think, that in this first 12-team playoff, they are going to allow the Big Ten and the SEC to have 8 of the 12 teams? Because I just don't think that they want that to happen. Otherwise, because they know, they know where this is going, which is in the next few years, it's going to be a 16-team playoff, and then there's going to be 10 Big Ten and SEC schools in it. Like, are they not somewhat obligated right now to mitigate the Big Ten and SEC influence in order to try and win negotiations against those leagues down the road? Because those two leagues are obviously working behind the scenes to build their own coalition. And so if you allow that to happen and you give them the power by putting 2/3 of the playoff as their teams, like, aren't you just completely abandoning or softening your negotiation stance?
I don't know. I mean, the Big Ten and the SEC are always going to have the most leverage because they have the most good teams and they have the most investment in the sport. And like they're barreling towards having 8 in this first version of the 12-team playoff because their strengths of schedules are better and their records are better. People can grasp it. This Indiana situation is so unique in a lot of ways, and the fact that BYU is in it, like, you can set that part aside because they have.
But if BYU loses, they're not getting in with 1 loss.
They can win a conference championship. I mean, that's
so if they lose in the Big 12 championship and that's their only loss, do you think they'll still get in?
No, probably not, because again, we're not talking about a Big Ten or an SEC team. Like, BYU's strength of schedule is just about the same caliber of Indiana's. Not exactly, but it's in that same ballpark. So I think that the incentive of trying and I guess I don't really love the way that the buys are structured, but guaranteeing access to the 4 highest conference champions is meaningful because Indiana currently has a path to do that. BYU currently has a path to do that. And no one in their right minds using the eye test, which again, in some ways, the selection committee has used that in the past, would look at Ohio State's roster, Georgia's roster, Alabama's roster, Ole Miss's roster compared to the Indianas or the BYUs of the world and say, well, could they win 4 games against those teams in a row? No, they would not. I don't believe they would. And I think most people objectively watching them would agree with that sentiment. If you don't, so be it. I'd love to see it happen. But it's not going to.
Yeah, it's such a weird conversation because like when this era of college football started, the argument was, well, you're going to invalidate the games. You're going to invalidate the regular season games. And people are like, no, you still have to win the games to get there. So now if you do win 11 games and then you still don't make it, like, that is very hard to swallow.
No, I don't disagree with you on that front,
especially as a Big Ten team. Like you still have to win. I understand Indiana's schedule has been gratuitous this year with who they've been able to avoid, but it does seem like they'd be punished.
You know what, Berm? There's somebody I know on this very show who has been saying for quite some time that if the clearest path forward is a conference championship, then maybe you should make the conference championship as equitable as possible. And it's never going to be perfect if you have 18 teams in your league, but you can get a couple steps closer. And what's the way to do that, Berm?
No, all conference games?
All conference games. Because guess what? Indiana's strength of schedule would be better. And maybe if they had to play Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan all at the same time, or throw whoever else you want in there, you'd say, well, they went 11-1 against this schedule, and then because of the tiebreaker, they didn't get in. They've earned it. They put everybody in front of them that the Big Ten asked them to, and also I think they may go hand in hand if you're fighting for 3 guaranteed spots for the Big Ten, or if they get greedy and both the SEC and Big Ten want 4. Like, I don't know how that conversation's going to go, but like Indiana has a path, and to give them credit, I want to give them credit. They have played and beat everyone in front of them. That never happens to Indiana. That's why they're accomplishing something that never has been done for them before. If they beat Ohio State and then Purdue, which they're going to beat Purdue, they'll have won a conference championship and no one can deny it. And you could stand back and say, well, they only had to do that to beat one good team to get there. Well, okay. Make them play 12 conference games. Make Ohio State do that. Make Oregon do that. Make Penn State do that. Like, make everyone do that. That's the best way to manage this.
I mean, I know I'm going to end up playing both sides against the middle here because I think Indiana should not be overlooked if they end up being 12 or 11-1 heading into the not playing a title game but finishing 11-1. Their non-conference games were FIU, Western Illinois, and Charlotte. Yeesh, that is rough. So I get it.
That's the problem.
Like, it seems like no one's ever going to be happy ever again. Remember what happened? But Indiana has to, avoid Florida Stating themselves, right? Like where you make a big stink about not getting in if you don't get in, and you have to replace a whole roster because you brought in 50 transfers, and then the next year you're 1-10.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a completely separate conversation. We'll have plenty of time to talk about Indiana next week on the podcast daily. But
you asked me what was bothering me, and that's what's bothering me.
I wanted to hear it. I'm not saying you shouldn't have talked about the playoff or Indiana, because
other than my Bursa sacks, that's what's bothering me the most.
Good. That seems like a nice place to wrap it up on a 3 Things Thursday, 2 days away from Ohio State at Northwestern, Wrigley Field. Can't wait. 11 a.m. local time. Berm and I, of course, will be hitting the road on Friday, but not before we get into some bold predictions on Freaky Friday. That'll be tomorrow on the podcast daily. Thanks for joining us today, though. He's Berm. I'm Austin. Talk to you later.